we're excited to be here and have a great conversation about using archival in documentaries. I'm excited about the panel that we got here. And so let's start. Archival use in films. I'm always interested to see films that have archival. It's a great way to, I guess, take elements from the past and bring them to the present and see what they can teach us about the past and also about the present. And so let's have everybody introduce themselves. They'll tell you a little bit about their careers and what led them to this point. And 4 of them are here with films, and Bill is here as a executive who has overseen many projects that use archival in them. Let's start with Dan Lindsey down on the end.
Hello. Yes. Hey. My name is Dan Lindsey. I am one half of a filmmaking team. My creative partner, TJ Martin, and I, our first film was called Undefeated, which is a story of a high school football team in Memphis. And our second film is LA 92, which just came out this year. And it's a film about the 1992 civil unrest in Los Angeles that we made entirely with archival material. There's no interviews or voiceover. And the intent was to create a kind of experience for the audience, to place the audience back in that moment. And I can later talk about some of the reasons, other creative decisions that we made.
Great. And I forgot to say that I've asked everybody if they would to think of a film that they've seen that inspired them with its use of archival material. And
I mean, there was a lot, several, but I think one that kind of was definitely on our minds when we started thinking about it was Brett Morgan's June 17th, 1994, that I believe Andy Greaves edited.
Yep.
That was just in terms of structure and content, and also that is without any interviews or voiceover.
So this was a ESPN 30 for 30 film that told the story of the day of OJ's Bronco chase, and it was all archival footage, and amazing in the way that it brought together all the events that were happening that day. It was a really busy day in sports history, with Arnold Palmer retiring, and the Knicks were in the finals, and there were a couple other events that I'm forgetting.
Yeah, the Rangers had won the NHL, but a ton of it. The World Cup was beginning in the United States.
Yeah. Alice Elliott.
Hi. My mission as a filmmaker, I make films about people with disabilities, giving voice to people who don't normally have voices. And I'm also making films about communities in transition. So my film at the festival is Miracle on 42nd Street, which is about affordable housing for artists, and Manhattan Plaza and the transformation of Times Square. And up until this film, I worked mainly in verite. And so the film that I really admired and that inspired me was Nancy Bursky's The Loving Story. I just was breathless watching that. And then this film, Miracle on 42nd Street, brought me into the world of archival footage and this exciting way of bringing the past to life. That I came to New York as a young actress in the 70s, and I actually thought I was going to go over to try to live in Manhattan Plaza, and I got halfway there and I thought, what am I thinking? I come home late at night by myself, I can't walk through this neighborhood. And so to my eternal regret, I didn't go even for my interview to have an apartment there. And how can I let my students and my colleagues know what it was like in the 70s in New York? And so we were, with the help of Sheila Manier, our wonderful archivist, that we found this footage that really shows you what it was like. And I think it's very hard for people to believe that that's what Midtown Manhattan was like. So that's, to me, one of the really exciting things about archival footage.
And the film premieres today at 1:30 after this panel at SVA.
So you can run with me over there.
Yeah. Sierra Pettengill is next.
Hi, I am an archival producer and an archivist, and then also a filmmaker. And the film that I made that Francisco edited, The Reagan Show, is all archival about the way that Reagan used PR and television and moving image as a force to help him end the Cold War. And that film, like LA 92, there's no interviews or voiceover, and there's no footage that's not from within the Reagan, 80 to 88. And I started as an archival researcher, and I also produce films. I produced a film called Cutie the Boxer, and I do a lot of work with archival, but also have made a verite film, a little incoherent. But yeah, I'm working on another feature-length all-archival film set in the late 60s and 70s now. And the film that, I don't know that it directly inspired the Reagan Show, but that sort of is something that's inspired me in how I think about the use of archival and the ways that it can kind of transcend sort of mere illustration of a time, is Adam Curtis's work. And he has unfettered access to all of the BBC's archives, and he has this very liberal way of using and reappropriating footage for emotional reasons and for humorous reasons, and it's a incredibly, it feels like painting to me with history, and so his work has been really inspiring to me.
And if people want to watch some of his work, one of his films is Hyper Normalization. That's one you can find.
The new, yeah, and they're all sort of on YouTube and leaked, and
they don't make it easy to find, really.
Yeah, but I think I've had this suspicion that he's kind of uploading them for us. Yeah, I forgot this is being recorded. That's a good reminder of that. Yeah.
Francisco Bello.
Yeah, I'm Francisco Bello. As Sierra said, I worked on The Reagan Show as one of the editors, co-writer as well. I've edited a bunch of films over the years, mostly docs, and I'm thinking, as far as the ones that are relevant, I would say, as far as creative archive, there was a film I worked on years ago called War Done Done, where we had all this footage from a war crimes tribunal that was self-shot, self-documentation, as well as footage from rebels in Sierra Leone, and did some creative things with that material, and it was sort of the centerpiece in some ways of that film. I also worked on a film called Our Nixon, so that makes The Reagan Show now my second presidential found footage film that I've worked on. It's a weird niche, but it's fun. And as far as, it's not, if we broadly define archival as inherited footage or found footage, the film that I come to very often as an editor is F for Fake, often credited as Orson Welles' last film, but that's also complicated. The story of that film is that there was a French DP and cinematographer, if I pronounce his name wrong, I apologize, Francois Reichenbach, who had been making a documentary himself about a art forger. And the story is, and there's disputed stories about the origin of it, but that he went to Welles and said, I need you to help me edit this, because I kind of don't know how to construct this film. And Welles did. It became a Welles film. It expanded and went broadly beyond biopic of this art forger and became a meditation on storytelling and lying and charlatanism and magic. And it's crazy and brilliant. And it's very unclear where the directorial, editorial lines are, because it began as a weird editorial mishmash. But the result is just incredible, perhaps dated in some of its, stylistic and other positions, but just fascinating.
Great. And next we have Bill Howard.
I'm Bill Howard. I'm a producer and nonfiction executive producer. I've worked at various nonfiction networks, including Discovery Channel, Travel Channel, Military Channel, as an executive producer. I'm an advisor to Pond 5 and work with them on developing their their archival and nonfiction footage strategy, and work closely with artists and filmmakers to bring source material and archival material to make stories. And in terms of the inspiration, I would say I'm a huge fan of home movies, and in fact at Pond 5 we're collecting a lot of home movies that can be licensed out to use for storytelling. But I would have to say Nicole Rittenmeyer's Third Reich, Rise and Fall, because she found home movies from 1930s and 40s Germany and told a story that everyone thought they knew in a new way.
Right, thank you. My name's Garrett Savage, and I've worked as an editor and a producer, and one of the films I edited was My Perestroika, which is archival heavy. It's a story about 5 Russians who grew up in Moscow in the 70s and 80s. They were part of the last generation to grow up under communism, and they're speaking now, reflecting on what their childhood was like. And the director, Robin Hessman, got access to the Russian state film archives, 35 millimeter films there, and a lot of that footage hasn't been seen in America. She wanted to tell the film through the point of view of Russians, to only show images that Russians would have seen at the time versus showing television footage from the United States, for example, or newscasts. And then she also asked families to send her home movies from Moscow and Russia in those years, and she got 40 families who sent in home movies. So we were able to use all that footage in combination with current day footage. And the film that I would talk about, and I run the Karen Schmira Film Editing Fellowship, and we help emerging editors and the editorial community at large and try to build community and support. And not because of that, but one of my favorite films, even before I knew Karen, was The Fog of War. Not only because of its use of archival footage, but I was rewatching some of it, just the way that archival footage is used in combination with this foreboding, melancholy, dark music. And I was noticing the way that the archival is used is there's a lot of slow motion. Nearly every shot in that film is slowed down to some effect, and it really increases that sense of foreboding and sort of the presence of evil in the world, but it also allows you to really look at the images. It's used very judiciously, and so that's my answer. All right, thank you guys. So let's move on. We're going to talk about archival under 2 rubrics. The first will be about acquiring the footage and finding it, licensing it, and then the second will be more of creative use of it. We're going to show some clips here at the beginning. I thought of what is archival footage. Francisco, you sort of mentioned it, and I wonder if is it anything more than as simply footage that was shot for another purpose that you're using in your project? Is that maybe the broadest definition? Is there any other way of defining it?
That's as good as I can think of on a Saturday morning. Yeah, I mean,
or not even footage, actually, material. Right? Material intended for another
purpose. It could be audio,
purpose.
it could be photographs, it could be, it's an artifact of some sort that doesn't have its origins in the making of the film.
Right.
That word.
Documents, actually, again, in Fog of War, there's lots of documents, and the way they cut them up, like close-ups, bam, 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 numbers, words. So I'm curious to find out, in each of your cases, how you found your footage that you used in your film. Maybe you can talk about where you started, where that led you, and then later let's talk about archival researchers, because I know that's also another great way to find archival footage if you have the budget for it. So we'll go one by one, and people will address that question, and then we'll show clips from each of their films. We're going to start with Alice, and she's going to talk about Miracle on 42nd Street.
Sure. Well, we had this legendary footage that we wanted to find, that people remembered. There was this story that was done on ABC about 42nd Street. And so we really put a lot of time and energy to find this particular footage and all the outtakes of it. So we were lucky, we did find it, and then we worked with it for quite a while using it. And it got to be time to license it, which was almost 10 years from when we started the film. And ABC said, no, we don't have that footage. And we had all these time codes. We had exact information about the footage. And they had reorganized their archives, and they denied it. And we knew that it was theirs. We knew we couldn't use it without their permission. So it was quite a moment of panic, really. And then luckily we had Sheila, as I mentioned before, Sheila Menier went, and she very cleverly went back to the original archivist, and she very cleverly found all these ways of contacting people in the ABC archive who finally figured out how it had been renumbered and re-cataloged. And so I guess that's kind of our most dramatic search story.
It's a pretty good one. You want to show the clip?
Yeah, let's show
Okay.
the clip.
So Alice, within that clip, can you estimate how many different sources of footage do you think there were?
I don't know. Lisa, are you here? Our editor? Yeah, how many? How many sources? Yeah. Well, not only did we have the ABC News footage, but then we also had a film called Hell's Kitchen Chronicles, which was made by some local people that lived there, so we were able to use that. And then we used a lot of stills. There were a lot of photographers that were taking stills at that time. So that's what Lisa, who's
Lisa's last name? Lisa
Lisa Shreve. She's
Shreve,
standing in the
right
light
there.
right
She's
there.
in the light. It's perfect.
And Lisa was able to integrate those stills so beautifully with the moving images. I think, too, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was just a little bit about the ethics of that footage. Every time I see those young women who were, working, sex workers at the time, I wonder what's happened to them. And I wonder how they would feel if they saw their pictures now. And, that I feel this kind of responsibility to them. I have no idea, how to find them or, find out what happened to them. But always when you show archival footage, these are real people who hopefully have gone on to have lives. Yeah.
So at the beginning of your film, you had a rough cut and you were showing it to people. And I'm talking about the beginning of the actual film, not the
Right.
beginning of the process. But you were showing your rough cut, and you were getting some feedback about
Right.
the opening.
So we're going to show another little clip. So when we first started, we started with some of this archival stuff, and we got a lot of notes saying, why do you start with this really gritty footage? Why don't you start with something that'll really pull us in? And they said, you're starting kind of with your ugliest footage. And so we took it to heart. And we didn't have any more money to do any more filming, so we went to Pond 5, and we found these beautiful shots. And so we're going to just show like a 16 or 17 second clip of the opening of the film to show you how it changed the film. I think it really elevated the film.
And for those who haven't used a service like Pond 5 before, how did that work? You went to their website and
You
started
go to their
looking-
website and you type in, what's great about Pond 5 is that it's beautifully organized. So you can type in what you're looking for in New York City shots from 70s, 80s, 90s, SD shots, HD shots. We did bridges, aerial shots. And so we got these really beautiful. We could easily find them and pull them.
And you pay a one-time fee, or do you license it with a term?
That you can
know?
license for whatever your use is. So if your use is festival use, you can license for that, or if there are other, uses, you can do that too.
Okay.
Yeah, and especially people that are on a budget, that it really just saved us, I think. So, hats off.
All right. So Bill's gonna tell us.
So I have a clip to show as well. I suspect some of those shots were 4K as well. They're really pretty stuff, yeah. So I have a clip. It's not so much a film, but it was a little bit of a storytelling challenge. Pond 5 acquired a massive archive of archival footage in the last year, and how we presented that was a storytelling challenge in itself. So this is actually a little meta, because it's using archive to tell a story about using archive to tell the story.
So you shot all that?
I'm a lot older than I look.
So where did Pond 5 acquire this library of footage?
Well, they have a pretty extensive collection that is a combination of a library called Framepool, as well as a lot of crowdsource and found footage from individual contributors who can upload it and license it directly through Pond 5.
Oh yeah, that's another feature of Pond 5. If you have your own footage, maybe left over from a film you shot or from wherever, you can use Pond 5 to help you get that out and sold, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, Dan, why don't you tell us about the origins of LA92 and the footage that you worked with?
So the origins, well, at least our involvement in it, the film had been set up by the producers Simon and Jonathan Chin with National Geographic Documentary Films. And to set it up, sell it to National Geographic, Simon and Jonathan had put together, I guess what's referred to as a Sizzle Reel. And it was, like a 60 seconds of archival material from the 1992 civil unrest. And when Simon and Jonathan approached TJ and I, we've been really, really reluctant to do any kind of retrospective documentary work. Our kind of work has always been in cinema verite, and we just, as filmmakers and editors, want things to unfold in front of the camera. But this sizzle reel that they put together had a few moments of, I was 13, I think, at the time of the civil unrest in Los Angeles, and so I remembered bits of it, but I didn't remember the real human stories. And there was a couple clips that just really had a kind of an emotional resonance with us, and we thought to ourselves, well, could we make this film and kind of preserve the integrity of those moments, and could we approach it as if maybe all of this footage was just shot by cameramen that we had, contracted or whatever, and could we somehow, because that's how we would make a film, right? We'd go and shoot as much as we could during the event, and then we'd try to piece together a story with that footage. And so we just kind of took a leap of faith that would be possible, with a lot of people telling us it wouldn't be. And we assembled it was a small team of researchers, and they worked for a couple months going to kind of the usual suspects of broadcast outlets and archive houses, and gathered about 200 hours of footage, I think, by the time we started editing, but ultimately we would end up we'd acquire about 1,700 hours of footage that we made the film out of. We cast an extremely broad net, everything from home video, radio. We really bugged the city archives and taught the city archivists how to digitize footage. We went to community events and asked if people had video cameras at the time. It was really important to us that we try to represent as many points of view as we could. It was just the edit I can talk about maybe a little bit later, but it was a very kind of haphazardly, like, oh my God, we don't have much time, and how do we somehow make sense of this?
And I imagine, were you pushing during the entire edit of like, there's got to be something else for this, there's got to be...
Oh yeah, I mean, there's still like holy grail things that I know are out there somewhere in somebody's basement that but we weren't ever able to find. And it's also, just to speak to the idea, it's also about how people preserve and save these things. There was a lot of things that were made and produced at the time, and I think not only in film, but in our entire society, we tend to get really excited about new technologies and throw away other things, or even in our architecture, and then we, like, years later go, oh, wait a second, that was nice, why didn't we, and a lot of that gets tossed. So I think it's, just in terms of as a community of people that document things and film things, to try to preserve that stuff, because you never know when another generation will be able to come back and look at it in a new way.
Right. Right. Ready to show the clip?
Sure. Yeah. This is
where are we in the film?
This is the first night of the riots have broken out, and I chose this clip just because it has a lot. I mean, there's home video, there's satellite broadcast, kind of between newsrooms. There's police radio. There's police video from inside helicopters. There's all kinds of stuff. So yeah, this is kind of the chaos of night one. The most Hans Zimmer sequence in the film. It's funny watching it out of context. And that's something the one last little point I would make is one of our concerns going into it was, would we be able to set the proper context? Because obviously that's very sensational imagery, but it's the truth of what happened. But we were concerned in watching, especially how the media covered it at the time. And we're relying on them to state certain facts, but how do we set the proper context so that you can watch and feel what the city was going through to understand how something like that happens? And so, that's probably an hour into the film. There's an hour of lead up to how that all happens.
Yeah. This may not be exactly what you're talking about, but one thing I appreciated in the film was there's a section where it's kind of the calm before the storm. And so there was some rather, on its own, probably kind of boring quotidian just footage of like Los Angeles. But I appreciated that you found that. I don't know if that was easy to find, just because it's kind of not much happening, but you have several shots of like, here's LA before the storm.
What's funny is those are all, so because we were working with, it was National Geographic as part of the Fox company brand. I don't know how you explain that. But the local Fox affiliate, KTTV, then was, we had to really press them. None of this was easy, but we were always like, we need your raw tapes. We need the, not just the clip reels that you send out when somebody asks for this. All of the shots you're talking about were all, they finally just gave up and were just like, we're just gonna give you a bunch of tapes and you guys can go through this. And it was all the plates that they used for the weather to put the weather up during that time. And it was just like, oh, here's some people playing tennis. Here's the traffic on the 405. And we're like, awesome, steady, perfect shots. Then that's how we.
That's great. That's a great example of just how you can keep digging to really find the stuff. Yeah, they had in their head what they thought you wanted, and it wasn't quite exactly. Yeah. How much of one more question, then we'll move on. I was thinking about the point of view of your film, and I'm sure at a certain point you realized it shouldn't just be through the eyes of the media. It needs to be through the eyes of citizens as well.
Yeah, it was really important to us. In fact, one of our kind of thematics, TJ and I are always, I think a lot of filmmakers, but we're always thinking of thematics and try to funnel everything through that. And one of our big themes was the facades of the history of our country, the story we tell ourselves, and then the reality. And one of those was the media. And so it was really important to us that we find these moments, like you saw a short example of it in there, where either the media is getting ready or they're off air talking, very calmly, and then they get on the air and they're like, oh my God, I can't, to be able to demonstrate that, yes, we are gonna lean on these voices every once in a while to kind of orient you in time and place, but they are as untrustworthy as anyone else, and that they have they are presenting this in their own way. And then on top of it, it was just finding home video and just people that were out on the street that just felt compelled to capture what was happening. And we try our best to hop around those, and never succeeding fully. I don't think it would be impossible to represent everyone's point of view in something like that. But it was our goal to show as much as possible.
Well, your comments about showing what happens, it's not before the camera's rolling, but while the cameras are rolling, but we're not live, leads us to our next film, right? The Reagan Show. Sierra, you want to talk about that?
Sure, yeah, that's a lot of what you just said was in our heads as we were making this film too, so it's interesting pairing, I guess. The film started, I have a co-director, Pacho Velez, and he had heard that there was, in the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, there was a giant archive called the White House Television Office, which was the Reagan administration hiring a Department of the Navy to document all of his public events over 8 years. And other presidents have done this before and since, but the combination of Reagan's kind of televisual focus, obsession, and skill, and the advances in technology made this archive bigger and sort of kind of more relevant for the man, or a way that you can look at the man through his images. So we started there, and we knew from the beginning that we wanted the film to be about PR, television, how Reagan uses imagery as a way of governing. And that remained sort of at the core of our interest, but where the plot and the story would go came just from watching footage. So I think we all told watched about 1,000 hours. And so we kind of just sat in that archive for probably a year and a half, just watching, and came to the Cold War storyline as being kind of the best way to examine what was happening. And then kind of halfway through, similar to your point, Dan, you can't talk about how Reagan is manipulating media and manipulating images without looking at some of the effects that have, and how the network news, how the media is picking that up, and how that's influencing the story. Because one of, I think my kind of ongoing focus is the stories we tell ourselves and how those get consolidated and congealed, and what the mechanisms are in American society to help cement those. And so we brought in a lot of news material to both contextualize what's happening. There, it's a tricky thing. You're using the news to provide information to help move the story along and guide the audience as to what you're looking at, but we're also commenting on the news and showing, just trying to lay bare kind of the way that these different worlds of the Reagan archive and the media are different and interacting with each other, and kind of in this push and pull. And so, Francisco, actually, we spent a long time trying to figure out what the visual language of that is, because I think this project was really exciting for me, because I think oftentimes I've worked on films where, even great films, where archival is being used to illustrate, or it's being brought in to show you something, and the authorship doesn't really matter. The kind of larger body of who paid for this archive, what was it intended for? What does the authorship tell you about what you're looking at? Which we all know from shooting our own stuff. Of course it matters. I have a point of view as a director. And so in this film, I kind of felt like I finally got to talk about, or look at who's shooting what and why, and that's one of the kind of central concerns. So coming up with a visual language of how do you make it clear to the audience what they're which source they're watching and when, was something that, Francisco kind of saved the day on. And so this clip will show a lot of, hopefully a lot of that.
Great. And where does this clip happen in the course of the film?
1987.
And
this is the
I could tell
end
you
of the second act.
Okay. It's about 53 minutes in, too.
Yeah, end of the second act. It's right before Iran-Contra. 86. We did something that we came up with in the film is this idea that repetition actually really helps you see the differences in performance and behavior, and kind of an evolving time frame. And so there's a lot of scenes that we see happen cyclically, and so there's a 1987 New Year's address that happens just before Iran-Contra. This is the first one in the film.
Since we showed that clip, maybe we can just talk a little bit about some ethical issues of you have this footage of a public figure where they don't know they're being filmed, and certainly not expecting to be having it watched decades later. It helps reveal to us who they were and their attitude during the time or in that moment. Did you guys wrestle with any questions of whether or not to show it, or was it a pretty clear
I think it was
decision?
actually quite the opposite. I mean, in contrast to your film, this is somebody who, whose politics I'm not aligned with, who is a very powerful person who set the course for the decades to follow. This archive is in the public domain. It's paid for by the American people, and it belongs to the American people. And so that was actually very exciting for me, is the idea of taking something that Reagan has made and reusing that to tell a story that he wouldn't have told. And this was made public in 1998, and so it was always the plan. And so while there's revealing moments, you're not ever in, there's not that much that shows him terribly compromised. So I think our ethical struggle was actually, how do we use something that he's shooting more or less as propaganda and not be repeating that propaganda? And that's, I think, why the news became such an important force in the film, is to help frame what you're watching.
In the case of this clip, you have sort of both sides of the same coin, and that's why it's a good choice in the context of this conversation, because it's sort of in a microcosm what we're trying to do throughout the body of the piece, where you're sort of seeing the public projection, the creation of the image, but then also these moments where he's not breaking the fourth wall, but he's sort of revealing what he really thinks or what he really believes in relation to actually the persona that he's projecting. It's consistent in this case, but there's other cases where, the veneer of a leader who's in control, that the media challenges throughout, and at the time it's pretty surprising to see from the archive that Sierra and the rest of the team pulled, of how self-referential and self-aware the pundits and the reporters were at the time of these very machinations, these PR statements, these publicity stunts, Reagan's background as a Hollywood actor and his charisma, but we don't have the commentary from the media in this case, but this is essentially a pretty decent distillation of that balance we tried to strike throughout the entirety of the piece, the private and the public Reagan.
Yeah, and to that point, it's a kind of fascinating moment in media history, because Reagan is kind of the first one who's taking performance to this level, and it's the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle. CNN is formed in 1980, and so the press is sort of, they're commenting on it. They're referring to Reagan's manipulation. They're taken in by it on one hand, but they're also questioning it, and so it's something you really don't see so much now. And so watching, it feels like this very awkward moment where the media is really changing, and you can watch it in real time as people are trying to figure out how to handle that.
Let's talk back on like a nuts and bolts question. Let's talk about fair use claims to footage, and also maybe incorporated into that also just give people an idea who maybe haven't worked with licensing archival footage before, how much some of this stuff costs if people are thinking of embarking upon an archival project.
Yeah, cut me off because this gets very dull very quickly.
All right,
and I
go.
didn't bring my spreadsheets, so you're welcome. Yeah, no, really, rein me in.
Okay, we've got 20 minutes,
I'll
so I
watch
will.
Everyone's eyes closing. So I guess maybe it makes more sense to talk about this film. So the footage, we kind of at the rough cut stage partnered with CNN, and so that helped. We got free access to their archive, so that was a major help in this. And then the Reagan footage is all public domain, so you don't need to license it. And the news footage is a mix of fair use, where you see that the kind of burn-in on the top with the network ID. That's all fair use footage, and that was mostly sourced from the Vanderbilt TV News Archive, which is an incredible resource at the Vanderbilt University. They have digitized news from the 60s onwards, and you can borrow a DVD that costs like $25. Yeah.
Why is that footage fair use?
It's not inherently fair use.
Okay.
We made
You
a
made the
fair use
claim.
claim
Mhm.
to use that, and so there's a fair use. Also, I'm not a lawyer, but fair use. There's a lot of there's a lot of rules there of what constitutes fair use, and but one of the things is that if you're requesting it from the copyright owner and they give you a low-res screener, that is considered by some lawyers an implicit contract. So you can't say, "Oh, you gave that to me, and now I'm using it as fair use." You'll have to license it at that point. so Vanderbilt is a third-party source where you can, if you want to save yourself the kind of room to have a fair use claim, we use that as much as possible. And at the very end, at licensing, at some points, we were like, that looks too bad. We made a kind of budgetary and aesthetic set of decisions about what we were going to license that we had originally gotten from Vanderbilt, just to give ourselves that option at the end.
Mm-hmm. So one takeaway is if you are about to embark upon an archival project, talk to a lawyer. Better to talk to a lawyer at the beginning than at the end.
Yeah. I've said this is like, I consider our fair use lawyer, Donaldson and Califf, to be like a key member of our creative team, because from when we had the idea of the project, I called them and was like, can we just talk through what we're thinking of doing and how this might work legally, and how much, because if you're going to license the entire film, that's at least $1 million budget, and we didn't have that. And so we kind of had an ongoing conversation with the lawyer all the way throughout as we were trying to figure out how to make the film, and that we'd kind of check in every few months and show them a cut and say, where are we? Yeah, and I think for a film like this, that's this much archival, that was a really crucial thing. Yeah.
I think it's just worth noting too, just quickly, that everything, there's ranges of prices, and archives will have, if it's non-broadcast, it might be a bit less expensive. If there's talent on camera, sometimes you can't use it, sometimes you can, sometimes you have to pay a huge premium for it. It's just all over the board. And also, if you're going to one source and you just need one clip, it's going to be more expensive than if you're going to one source and getting a ton of clips from them. They'll usually make a deal with you. So yeah, that's just... Yeah,
like they'll often have a 30-second minimum, so if you need a 6-second clip, you're paying for 30 seconds anyway. And that's a great point. Like, any on-air personality tends to be double and has to go through, the network will go through a long legal check to make sure that they're okay with how you're using it. So, we fair used all the on-camera personalities, basically.
So I was going to just jump in, because I did talk to Laverne Berry, my lawyer, just before the panel, and I wanted to, just some of her notes were a reminder to me that fair use is not a right. It's a balance of the needs of the filmmaker and the balance of the needs of the copyright holder. And that's why you should always take your concerns to a lawyer. And she said the very basic idea is, if I wanted to show something happening on 42nd Street, and I went and I said, this was happening on 42nd Street, and news outlets across the country picked it up. And so we said in Chicago they talked about it, in Los Angeles they talked about it. So then that would be a more leaning toward fair use of the material. If I wanted to say this was happening on 42nd Street and I only showed this particular news program from ABC, which we have in our film, for example, the AIDS crisis hit Manhattan Plaza very hard, and ABC did the story on it, and so it wasn't picked up by the rest of the country, so that we needed to license, and we needed to license the on-air talent as well. So it's confusing. There are many ways of interpreting it, and I think it's really to just get it right in mind right away when you start.
Yeah, because it's also like it's a real blessing. When I started doing archival research, people weren't really making as robust fair use claims. This is kind of newer to me in the last few years. The kind of strength of the fair use process now, and so it's something to just make sure that you're keeping in mind, and that balance of the copyright holder and the film is an important one, because we're also filmmaker. I respect my own copyright. I would like people to respect my copyright, and so it's not this, I don't deserve all of this footage, and but fair use exists for a reason. And one of the biggest claims is if you're commenting on or critiquing material, and that is made much more easy if you have a voiceover track, because you can write that narration to point towards, they're telling you what you're looking at and why. So your film, I think it was probably helped by that. Ours was probably a little trickier in that. But for us, at least, I think because we were critiquing the media, and it was a media critique, and that's something we talked about right away with the lawyer, that's kind of part of the central conceit of the film that helped our fair use claim.
Right. So again, we're not lawyers, we're just filmmakers, but
Not lawyer. Not
there
a
will
lawyer.
be lawyers here on, Deborah, is it Thursday? So there's a whole day of law, issues around law and documentaries, so come back and check that out. I have another hour of questions that we haven't gotten to, but you probably have questions also, and we've got about 10 minutes for that. So we'll go to the audience. You, sir?
Thanks. You talked about 1,700 hours and hundreds of hours. How do you possibly get through that and sort of digest that and kind of pull it together?
How do you get through 1,700 or 1,000 hours and digest it?
Very haphazardly, not a lot of sleep. Luckily, TJ and I, we cut our own material, so and there's two of us, so we tend to split things up. Some things, when you get a 2-hour videotape that somebody happened to record, and you can kind of scan through pretty quickly and be like, oh, this is your birthday party 5 days before this happened, and then, oh, it's just this little bit at the end. Honestly, I think ideally we would have had 2 years to edit this film, and we had 9 months. And so some of it is just you're using a lot of instinct. And similar to, when you're shooting, like I always talk about, the audience never knows what you didn't, what you missed when you're shooting. So you can't beat yourself up about, like, oh, I missed that moment. Your job is to tell, the story, and I think we thought of that sometimes with this. Like, if we consumed ourselves with, oh my God, we have to see everything and log all of this stuff, we just would never have finished. But that said, we did pretty much see everything that got our eyes on almost everything.
In the white? Ursula, sorry. Her first part of her question is, a lot of archives don't have a ton of footage of underrepresented communities, and so can you recommend places to go for that, or strategies to find that footage? And the second part of it was ballpark negotiation in terms of rates on paying for this stuff?
So I would just jump in, that we were talking about this previously. The Pralinger Archive in San Francisco, Rick Pralinger has collected so much amazing archival footage, home movies, from very, very diverse sources. And this is available online. It's through donation. It's just a wonderful service to the film community. And just a little shout out to him. He's going to have a program tomorrow at the Skirball Center at NYU called Lost Landscapes of New York. But this is the Pralinger Archive.
And is that internetarchive.org?
Archive.org.
Oh,
Yeah.
archive.org.
And then, Sheila, what's the library up on 125th Street?
Schomburg?
The Schomburg Center. So we did a lot of, I could have spent weeks there looking at the history of theater and African American performers and small groups of performers. So they just had tons and tons of stills that were just so fantastic. And then tracking down the photographers was another job in itself. But so that's a great resource in New York, the Schomburg Library.
I can just quickly say, in our film, it was really difficult, especially the Latino perspective in LA. None of the stations had kept any of the Spanish-speaking radio or television had kept their archive. Univision it got lost somewhere along the way, which was, we were able to get some, but I feel it's a disappointment in the film. In my opinion, I wish we had more of a representation of it. And then we're able to create a strong relationship with Radio Korea and some of the local Korean TV stations, but that was difficult. We really had to go and spend time and talk to them, explain our intentions. That story in particular in the Korean community in Los Angeles has been portrayed in their eyes very one-sided, and it was really important to us that we try to show that and also get that experience. So the Radio Korea for us was really the greatest thing that we came upon, because it was Korean people speaking in Korean, calling into a radio station where they were saying, "This is happening here," or "Has anybody heard about the store that's over here?" Or like, and it was this kind of central hub of communication. It was the first time we had felt like we were seeing an actual true voice, whereas the mainstream media was definitely like sensationalizing, because a lot of Korean store owners armed themselves to protect their businesses, and it became this kind of that was just the side of the story, and nobody understood that the police weren't coming to protect them, and all of that plays out on Radio Korea. So that was a big thing for us to be able to find that.
And can you clarify the second part of your question about negotiating? What are some ballpark figures to pay citizens who may have shot material that you want to use in your film?
I would say first of all, because we had a lot of this, people have unrealistic expectations. They think like, oh, you're Hollywood. So the first ballpark figures we got from some people that had filmed some of the Flashpoint stuff was like, I remember the one guy he wanted, I think it was $15,000 a second, or $20,000 a second, or something like that. And we were negotiating with his lawyer. I mean, eventually brought that down, but I think it's, again, you have to explain your circumstances, and it ultimately becomes a negotiation. I'm sure you've dealt with it before, but I would say people have very unrealistic expectations of what they're going to get paid.
Yeah, and I think there's also, my answer to that question is always time. Like my general answer to your question as well about how you get through all the 1,000 hours. I think people think that, archival takes a very long time, and those relationships build, and it's like a relationship with a subject you would have as a verite shooter. You have to earn trust, and you have to spend time, and you have to be in a community in the same way that you do. And I know sometimes, I didn't realize Sheila was here, but when you're hired as an archivist, that can be a frustrating thing where I don't have some magic wand to convince someone, particularly of a marginalized community, who should not trust me to just give me things because that's my job title. And so I think allowing yourself the same time to be working with a community member in the same respectful way you would as a filmmaker, I think it's a similar process. People have unrealistic expectations, but there's also this, and we're not going to solve it in this room, but there's this thing that ends up happening oftentimes in production where the corporate archival rates are going to be what they are, and you can get them down a bit, but there's only so far you can go, so that you plan on, okay, all the people who don't know better will give me cheaper footage. And I think there's something quite backwards there that I don't know how, I can't solve that because we can't make budgets bigger, but it is something I've been thinking about, which is, how do you work that out? How are you being respectful and honoring somebody's work that maybe was more dangerous for them to shoot than it was for ABC to shoot? And that's a larger systemic problem, but I think one way, if you can't compensate for that with money, it's through attention and time, and inviting them to screenings and making sure that there's an investment in the people who are giving you footage. Not Ronald Reagan, but.
I just wanted to comment too that this is many times why we turned to Pond 5, because we knew that people had put their footage up there understanding that it would be licensable. They already knew what the parameters were, and I hope as we get more sort of crowdsourced locations for footage like Pond 5, that there will be a wider variety, and people will start using that both to let their footage out and get compensated fairly for it. Yeah.
I mean, this is not in the Reagan Show, but another film that I worked on, we decided to use a motif of storms building. It's a film about a neurological condition, and it just worked as a good visual metaphor. And there was this whole subset of shooters, storm chasers, who on the one hand are sort of news gatherers or scientific, and then the other ones that are just shooting, they just love to shoot beautiful tornadoes from the distance. And those were the guys we were after, right? Because it works good on a big screen. And we found that the best ones were not in an archive house. They were self-posting on YouTube montages of their best stuff with a little bit of contact info at the end. You're like, oh, great, ready-made. No. These guys a lot of them had no idea how it worked, and there was sort of an education process, sometimes even a tracking down. So what on the surface seemed, while we were editing, great, this is low-hanging fruit, it's available, they want a license, in fact turned out to be as hard as dealing with some kind of harder to pin sources.
And that's also part of a warning about using YouTube footage in general, right? Be careful. It's don't just start cutting your movie with YouTube footage and expect that you're going to be able to use it cheaply or easily. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I just want to clean up a couple things. I forgot to acknowledge a couple editors. I always, as somebody who champions editors, I always try to recognize them. The Fog of War was edited by Karen Schmira, Child King, and Doug Abel. And the film I worked on, My Perestroika, was also, I edited it with Alla Kofkin. And you will have some other editors in your film?
That's right. I worked as a team of editors. So there was David Barker and Daniel Garber as well, who made immense contributions to the film.
And we had David T. was a consulting editor who is around today, I think, as well.
And TJ and I brought in Scott Stevenson near kind of the end to help us because we were running out of time. And he's an incredible editor who did The Staircase and a bunch of other stuff. He was immensely helpful.
And Alice, why don't you give credit to your editor and editors also?
Of course, to Lisa Shreve, who we already saw, and Arash Oriam. And for Loving Story, I think it was...
You said it, I think, at the beginning. Oh, I wrote it down. Actually, let's...
Haviland, I think it was the last one. I sent you an email with
Elizabeth Haviland
Elizabeth
James.
Haviland. Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience.